welcome to the Texas System of Care Cultural and Linguistic Competence Podcast. My name is Shannon Moreno, and I'm the CLC, or Cultural and Linguistic Competence Specialist, with Texas System of Care. This podcast is devoted towards how to work with specific populations within your local system of care community and ensure that you're providing services that are culturally and linguistically appropriate. This series is focused on working with the Latino community. For a further explanation of CLC terminology, including terms used in this podcast, we recommend checking out the ABCs of CLC webinar series. Today we continue the conversation with Dr. Manuel Zamarripa, Professor of Counseling at South University in Round Rock, Texas. With the bit of time that we have left, are there any other pieces that, maybe from our conversation that you would like to highlight or kind of go back and visit?
Well, I think just a couple of things really quickly, because we did talk about the variety in the Latino population. But it's important to know that a lot of the research and the conversations and the discussions when we talk about the Latino population overwhelmingly are about first-generation immigrant populations. And so that's just important to keep in mind. It's an important piece, and usually the immigrant population is in need of resources. Usually it's not the wealthy that come to immigrate to look for a better life. It's a certain segment of the population. So it's important to keep that in the forefront. And that's usually the population we're trying to reach out toward more. So it's important because, as we've said, there are generalities, in the Latino community. And we need to recognize that a lot of the approaches and a lot of the discussion and a lot of the research has focused on immigrant Latino populations. And so be aware of that. To know that, we need to continue to try to make better connections with Latino immigrants, because we're not there yet. But also know that sometimes some of the recommendations and the readings and the research may not be as applicable to later generation Latinos if we're talking about generational status, right?
And that's because there may have been that acculturation of that generational piece there. So, but that is still a piece of the background. So it doesn't hurt to kind of have that awareness, and then it just may simply not apply for a particular individual if their generation's down.
Yeah, absolutely. I think also, what happens to the mental health profession is that we write them off like, okay, they're not as concerned because they're not dealing with a lot of the Latino issues, which really translates to immigration issues, in their stress reaction and their mental health. And so we assume that the other generations are, fine, and treat them as we would any other population. So there's definitely issues there that we don't talk about as much that we need to address. But for those that are of the immigrant population, we talked about language not being the sole piece of seeing how acculturated somebody is. Yeah. And that's definitely important, that it's not the only piece. But language is important for a lot of this population. And sometimes, the very idea of speaking Spanish is very connected to who they are as Latinos, as an identity. So we can't think of language as just another piece of, just another variable for a lot of people. It's a connection to who they are. So that's important if we're talking about translation, if we're talking about linguistic competency, that some of that uncomfortableness, it's not just an uncomfortableness of in the room if there's a translator. Is this person going to understand who I am, not just understand what I'm saying? I think that's an important piece. Those are important pieces.
Yeah, absolutely. I wonder if we can talk a little bit too about what you just brought up with the translation piece, because I think, again, that's something that a lot of folks think is just very, very simple. And I think they understand the importance of translation, but again, it's within that lens of accuracy of the specific words that are being translated. Right. When genuine translation, and ironically enough, accurate translation is much more than just the direct words, going across for in this example, maybe from Spanish to English, and then back from English to Spanish. Right. Can you speak to some of the kind of nuances of language and how it really is more complicated than just, this word equals this word?
Yeah. So one example is the use of dichos, sayings, right? Even the word dicho, a saying, we can say in English, oh, there's a saying, but a lot of the times, if you're trying to impart a life lesson, we might say there's a moral saying or there's a life lesson or something. But when you say dicho in Spanish, you're already implying that you're trying to get across a life lesson, a world perspective, a moral lesson. So even within that direct translation, the meaning of the word dicho has more nuances. But those dichos, those sayings, they have a certain context, and we may translate those directly to English, but they may not have the same impact because the context of what's important in those dichos may not be important to the provider. You may not understand the impact. So it's important to follow up why that's such an important saying, how that's helped the client, or how that's benefited them, or how they have utilized that in their life. Because usually when they're utilizing dichos with the mental health provider, what they're trying to do almost always is they're trying to communicate not just an idea, but they're trying to see if you know who they are. So they're throwing this out and saying, are you going to, I can't speak in the words you want me to, I'm not as used to it, or I'm embarrassed, or that's not how I talk. Here's this dicho. This tells you what I'm feeling or what I'm thinking is important or part of who I am. So it's important for the provider to try to, that their cultural tools to try to gain that is to follow up with why that saying is important and how it's benefited the client and what's important in their life and how it's helped them in their life, or some more background information about that. So those dichos are important ways of doing that. Also, just the idea of asking for multiple, not in an interrogation style, but in a conversational style, multiple examples of a situation. So if the client's giving an explanation or telling about a situation or talking about the impact that it's had, some situation has had on him or her emotionally, the therapist could, or the provider could, try to expand that a little bit more about, is that the worst you've ever felt? Is there a time you felt worse? Have that happened before? Tell me another time maybe that's happened. Has there been another time when you felt this way? To just give a little bit more context to what's being said. And then logistically, of course, we know that if there's a translator in the room, that the therapist always looks directly at the client, right? Not at the translator. The translator should know his or her role and not feel offended if the therapist is not looking at the translator.
And I think it's appropriate for the therapist to be aware, too, that the translator is not necessarily the end-all and be-all.
Right. They
may be someone with a very different background. They may know very different dichos than the client in the room.
Right.
And so, if the provider does not speak the same language as the client, obviously there's a need for the translator. And I'm not saying translators are bad. Absolutely not. There's a need there, but there's also a need for the awareness that the translator is human and comes from a very different background, or could potentially come from a very different background experience, and just having an awareness of that as well. Kind of mixing the idea of translation considerations and what will be brought up a few times with the explanatory models is I think that there also needs to be an awareness that not all phrases that sound almost exactly the same in English as far as like different illnesses are what we think. Like, for example, someone may say ataque de nervios. And you cannot assume as a provider that when they say that they've experienced that they've experienced anxiety attacks as we define them in the DSM. Can you speak to that a little bit?
Yes. Okay, here's a little bit of a different cultural context. Being from San Antonio, and when I did see clients in San Antonio offering bilingual services or services in Spanish, one of the main things we had to do was, how do we say counseling, right? Terapia, psychotherapy, consejería, could be counseling, but it's kind of formal. And what we found is that even for the Spanish speakers, for a lot of the Spanish speakers and second generation, we use the term counseling because that's when they mostly encountered that here in the United States. And when they would hear the word counseling, they would know what it meant in that particular context. Mm-hmm. So sometimes you do have to really come from a position of not knowing and see what's is happening.
Yeah.
But if we're talking about depression, depresión, that may or may not mean the same thing for clients. Mm-hmm. And so one thing that can help providers is think about how they would take the next step to distinguish with, in colloquial language or with their peers in their lives when they're talking about certain illnesses. Because it's not uncommon to say, this person is feeling depressed. And sometimes we forget, well, do we mean clinically depressed? Do we mean, major depressive episode? Or do you mean, which is also a real, feeling, but maybe not clinically accurate, you're feeling depressed, feeling down. So we do it in our own language, so it's helpful to remember when you're dealing with translation that those are the same kind of questions. If you're giving the term of the illness or if the client's giving to us, where they heard that term, what their idea of that term is. Because they may say, well, my doctor says this. Or they may say, well, that's just when I'm feeling bad, we say that we're depressed. So trying to distinguish with the client, remembering to try to ask what the meaning is for that particular client, for that particular family. Ataque de nervios is a good one because it's a way of expressing a particular type of stress that doesn't easily translate into an anxiety attack or a panic attack. Mm-hmm. You see some similar expressions of grief in many African American communities at funerals, falling out, a wailing, a crying, falling down, needing to be picked up. Does that mean that those people feel more or grieve more? No, it's not a clear-cut linear answer of the truth. It's a cultural expression of grief that is genuine, but you'll see that in those communities more often than you will see it in other communities. And the linear way of thinking is, they're just learning a behavior, almost implying, not that it's fake, but that it's staged a little to show people how much I'm grieving. And that's inaccurate.
Because culturally, if you yourself are, let's just say, for example, Irish American, where you might try to save face as much as possible, kind of, bite your bottom lip type of a thing. And if you need to cry, mostly cry off to yourself when you're alone, then when you put that framework as being universal rather than cultural, then that is the conclusion you come to, is like, well, I would only do that if I were showing off.
Right, exactly.
Type of thing.
Exactly.
But, that's just another example of so many ways that actions and behaviors are so cultural at the end of the day.
Absolutely.
Yeah, absolutely.
I mean, talking to someone that has recently died, can also be a cultural expression of grief or connection or healing that is important to contextualize. Talking to a grandfather who has passed away and saying that they've seen or talked to him in the room that he lived in for 50 years, by his rocking chair, what have you, is very different than saying, there's a voice that's following me everywhere I go to work, then coming through the radio and then at the back. Then you have more questions to ask.
Yeah. Because
then the context is different. And both of those experiences can be very real or very real to the clients.
Yeah. One last question. What, in your mind, from your perspective, is the potential damage in either an individual provider or an organization or system as a whole having a colorblind framework or a cultural blind framework? And in what ways have you seen that actually take place?
The the word that comes to me at the very minimum is invalidation. And as mental health providers, we know that if experiences are invalidated, it's extremely damaging to one's sense of self and existence in the world. So while the societal notion or the sociological notion of trying to see people as equal, equating not seeing people's distinctions or cultural backgrounds may seem to come from a good place, it can invalidate people's experiences, so damaging their sense of self and who they are, completely contraindicated for any type of profession that is trying to connect with people that we want them to come to us for help, because it blocks them from us if that's the experience that they get. In doing that really makes the mental health system even more inaccessible. I think that is important to remember, because what we want is we want clients to talk to us. No matter what approach you're taking, from my perspective, it's all some form of storytelling. And if they're telling us who they are in their stories, and then we're invalidating them, then why am I going to tell you my story if you're just saying it's not real? Yeah, we need to know more about what's most important is their experience. And this is already validated in a Western perspective when we talk about crisis counseling. We already know that when we're dealing with in the mental health field, that a crisis is a crisis if the person experiences it as a crisis.
Right.
If they experience it as a crisis, it's a crisis because of the reaction it's having. And this should bode very well for for members of the general, the larger population, maybe middle class, upper class, because that's exactly the argument that they want to make is, I'm having a hard time in my life. And then I could say, well, I work with people that have real crisis. They're learning how to survive. They're dealing with depression. They're dealing with marginalization. They're dealing with violence. And so you're having a hard time in your relationship. I'm going to rate that as not as important in mental health. And I'm going to rate that as less important and less consequential. And that person's going through a real crisis. They're going through real pain. There's real depression. There's real anxiety. We know that has, that crosses all kinds of boundaries. But if I come from that framework and flip it, then I can easily categorize that as not valid or less valid, which is unethical. Yeah. Was there another piece to the question?
Yeah. Have you seen that play out in your career? Seen instances of either individual providers or just systems as a whole having a cookie cutter kind of colorblind approach? Absolutely.
Unfortunately, sometimes it's still difficult to talk about cultural distinctions in providing therapy. And, I've had colleagues that say good therapy is good therapy is good therapy. And, their best intention is that we need to know how to connect with all human beings. But the problem is that's the intent with everybody. But the problem is that intention usually is attached to there are some approaches that should work for everybody. There are some ways of interacting that if they work for one group of people should work for everybody. And that's where the distinction, lies, is that you can't talk about ways of being in the world to try to assist somebody if they don't have any experience of being in the world in that way. So people try to talk definitely that we should all be treated the same, which of course they're talking about trying to honor everybody's experience. But usually the notion is, again, not recognizing the distinction maybe between equality and equity. Talk about, right? Equitable treatment is not always treating everybody the same. Sometimes you treat people differently. It doesn't mean you treat them worse or you privilege them, but you treat them differently in order to treat them equitably. Right? If I have a client that is not coming out of his or her house and is in serious danger of harming him or herself sometimes, and family members are reaching out for me to treat that client. And I say, I treat everybody equal, and that means everyone comes to my office. Mm-hmm. Right? And if I go there, then I'm discriminating against my other clients by going to the house and saving that person from killing him or herself, because I treat everybody equal. So usually people don't think through the consequences of that notion. And a lot of the times when I see colleagues or peers, very frankly, they feel personally threatened. They feel somehow threatened or somehow personally accused, and it's a defensive reaction. And then you're not really having a real conversation about the real issues.
Which is, ironically enough, a fear response to a certain extent, right?
Yep.
I don't know how to even start. I thought that my background and my education and the knowledge I possess now would be sufficient.
Right.
And now you're telling me that I'm not at a point where I may be sufficient in working with necessarily all people who may come into my office.
Right.
And I think that speaks a lot to the concept of cultural humility and how all of us, regardless of your background, your education, your experiences, all of us always have more to learn, because the one person who comes in your door that day who may match on a checklist a number of other checklists you work with in the past, they're dynamic and they're different.
Right.
And so the need to always learn and always have, like you've said all along in this conversation, have those open-ended questions and get really to the meat of this person and where they fit in their family and in their community in a larger picture is so vitally important. And I think that is a piece that can be translated across working with all individuals. You may not necessarily right now possess a lot of, I keep saying checklists, but genuinely checklist knowledge of a particular population. But you can always have cultural humility in how you work with someone. I hope you enjoyed today's CLC podcast on working with the Latino community. If you have any questions on how to bring CLC initiatives into your local system of care community, please feel free to email us at info@txsystemofcare.org.